I'm gonna freak out if I'm not included real soon.
Welcome, friends, new and old. We're here discussing Frasier 2023, the revival, the continuation, the new adventures of old Frasier. However you want to refer to this show, we are up to episode 5, and it's entitled The Founders Society. Now, there will be some spoilers ahead, so take this as your final warning if those aren't for you. This will be a bit quicker than my normal videos. Hopefully next week I'll be able to get into the swing of doing a more lengthy, full-length type thing for this. But for right now, I found this episode, episode 5, to kind of be firing on all cylinders. So if you've been following me along, I did an episode. The first 3 episodes, well, they had merit. They had definite strengths, and they had characters that really were engaging. Alan, and to a slightly lesser extent, Freddie being the standout new versions of the characters. David was by far the one I took most issue with. Episode 4 was a little bit of an improvement, but David still fell by the wayside a little bit. Here, we definitely feel like we are settling in. The characters are now developing chemistry with each other. They're doing plot lines and characterizations that would really definitely fit in with the original Frasier run. Alan, in this episode particularly, felt straight out of an older Frasier episode. Sure, his character isn't a one-to-one replacement of somebody. He has moments where he's like Niles, but he also has moments where he's like Martin, and he has moments where he's his completely own thing, and I really like that. It definitely feels like an extension of the same universe. And the A-plot in this episode being the 3 main characters from Harvard, those being Frasier himself, Alan, and then Olivia, they need to vie for trying to get into the Founders Society at Harvard, but lo and behold, shenanigans ensue because there are only 2 spots available.
But we've gamed the system by forming an alliance.
So even though they go in with this united front, things devolve. They start to turn on each other because obviously that's what's going to happen. And there's nice misunderstandings and character moments here that felt smack dab out of the old Frasier. They go to talk to the person they think is the head of the club, and it turns out to be the waiter. So Olivia gets to speak with the real head of the club while Alan and Frasier are making putzes of themselves, just kind of chatting it up with the stoner waiter. I like those types of things. I liked the characterization here of Olivia because it made her out to be kind of the ditzy, doesn't understand what's going on like they did occasionally with somebody like Roz, out of her depth in this, but she isn't out of her depth.
Subguru Lachiamuseo.
They have this whole running gag about how they're speaking Latin in front of her because, you know, they assume she's too stupid and doesn't understand Latin.
Oh, Dr. Finch. I'd forgotten you're a fellow Latin buff.
I also really like the gag of Alan getting the gauntlet stuck on his hand.
What are you doing?
I'm trying on a priceless antique gauntlet. What's it look like, MD?
That's very Niles-ish, but the way he handles it definitely feels much more unlike Niles, because instead of being a neurotic mess, he kind of just goes with it throughout the rest of the episode, and he uses it to his advantage. And that's why I think this episode of the show in particular so far is a great example of why the 2023 revival is warranting its own existence. It's not just taking the Frasier idea and putting it on 1-to-1, it's updating it. It's giving these new characters life of their own with the Frasier shenanigans we've come to expect, but it's also doing new things. And speaking of new things, which weren't entirely new, the B-plot, which obviously to me was the weakest part of this episode, but it still wasn't poor. David is my least favorite character. He worked a lot better in this episode than I have previously thought he has. He even had one moment, one line that I looked at and said, you know what? I could absolutely see that coming from Niles. Being the child of Niles and of course Daphne, it makes sense that he would have these characteristics, but for the most part he hasn't been living up to them. And this B-plot was him trying to figure out how to speak to women and get a date with Freddie and of course Eve being kind of his teachers. The part that I thought was actually fairly well done and felt like old Frasier, and it actually felt like that one episode where Niles and Daphne kind of accidentally made Roz think that they wanted a menage with her. That's what it reminded me a little bit of. The moments in the bar, and particularly the moment where David went out into the hall of the apartment to try and ask Eve out, those 2 elements felt very, very much like a Big Bang Theory bit or a Big Bang Theory storyline, and that's where I felt it kind of disconnected from the Frasier that we've come to know. I didn't hate it. I didn't think it was the worst thing I've ever seen. It just didn't quite mesh with the rest of the show. I don't think that's a long-term problem. I don't think that doing these new things and trying to update the scenarios to a more, I was going to say a more modern type of sitcom, but Big Bang Theory is what, 20 years old, 15 years old at this point, so I guess that's not really modern. It is more modern than Frasier, though. Those things are inevitably going to happen, especially once you start bringing in writers and showrunners and all of these people that have worked on other sitcoms. You're going to run into situations like that, but I think overall this episode would fit in nicely if you're doing a watch of Frasier. You could slot it in with the original Frasier, and you wouldn't really miss a beat. You would feel that same sort of environment. You would feel those same sort of feelings that you get from the original Frasier, and I think that's one of the things that this show is going to need to do in order to persevere for the long haul. And quick, cover your ears if you don't want to be spoiled for guest characters returning, but we do know that Roz and we know that Lilith are returning to the show, so we definitely need these new characters to kind of stand on their own and have their legs under them before those characters show up. Otherwise, obviously, those returning characters that we've loved for so long are going to steal the spotlight, and we don't need that to happen, because I don't want this to turn into a situation where, what was that show? It wasn't The King of Queens, but it ended up becoming The King of Queens when they kicked out the original wife and brought back Leah Remini. I don't want this Frasier to become that. Yes, I want all of the original characters back. It would be great to see Niles and Daphne and Roz and Bulldog and all of them, but this show is trying to do something new. It's not trying to be the next season of Frasier, and I think that it would be detrimental to the characters in this show if they don't get a chance to become their own thing before bringing in the original cast. I'm very hopeful now that going forward things will continue improving and we will get classic episodes like this. I don't know if this episode would be an all-time classic in the pantheon of Frasier, but it really hit those high notes of the original, and I'm definitely looking forward to see more things like this in the future. What did you think? How are you finding the show? Have you checked out? Have you not been watching it yet? Leave all those thoughts down below. Like, share, subscribe, do all those YouTube things, and until next time...
Have you still got passion? We're in our 60s, man. What's wrong with good enough?